Okay, welcome everyone this evening to our second work session as we work to put together this very important policy. Just want to remind on the steps that have occurred over the last week. Board members were directed by Tara and John to identify the top 5 components for our policy as we think about what we would want in an equity policy. So I appreciate all of you giving us that feedback. From there, I compiled that in a variety of ways. And then over the weekend, really tried to identify the key themes that were consistent across all board members. And I do, Emily and Rowan, want to apologize that I didn't reach out and make sure I had your feedback. So I really encourage the two of you, if you have thoughts that you feel, certainly we can leverage Zinnia's ABC in terms of what you affirm or should be broadened or maybe conflicted or curious about. But if there's something in particular, please, as always, use your voice and share that with us. And so at this point, I think the majority of our work, I first want to do a thumbs up by my fellow board members. This was kind of work yesterday and this morning. Has everyone had a chance to read the 2 pages? Okay. So I wanted to honor that it was this morning, and if you needed some time to do that. And then for the record, Patty will include those materials in our minutes for the public to review as well. But at this point, I want to again thank John and Tara for being such wonderful assistants in this process. I'm going to hand it to them. I think they're really going to help guide us in really ensuring that we are identifying the practices that we are trying to shift and what are the conditions we are seeking once we can achieve those shifts and find that in our policy. But with that, I am happy to hand it over to John, Tara.
So I'll just say a few words in terms of context for this work. At the last meeting, we were kind of, the board and was kind of all over the place in terms of now what do we call this, and what is it that we actually stand for, and what are we going to change and be accountable for, and what do these words mean, and so as we talked through this, as Tara and I talked through this, we were thinking, let's really start with the practices. Let's really start with those components, with the statements, and then move to how do we want to name it, and so as Tara and I read what Maureen put together, there were some very strong themes that were in common, which was pretty amazing, and that gives you a lot to really take ground on. But I just wanted to say those first words and then open it for Tara to share perspective.
Thanks, John, and of course I'm in that same alignment. And reading through what folks shared, I was pleased with some of those pieces, of course, and just thinking about what came to mind for me is what's on the tail end of this. As a result of this policy, what are the actions, opportunities, and shifts that we actually see? Because for every idea shared, it should be connected to some sort of outcome, either setting the condition for certain things to happen, or an indicator, or a specifically measurable outcome, so that it really has meaning and it's not just words on a page. So tonight, as we talk about this, I'm really interested to hear from board members in connection with the ideas that they share, and as you talk about things and fine tune it a bit more, like really on the other end of this, what will it look like? What are you expecting to see? And how is that connected to your role as board members and the superintendent? And so with that, I will pass it to Maureen to start us off in the discussion, just going over the themes that she's highlighted in the sheet.
Thanks, Tara. And sorry to see that John had to leave, but I appreciate that and appreciated his counsel over the last couple of days. Before I do that, I just have so appreciated the input and feedback that we already received. And so I just wanted to thank Zinnia for quickly jumping in and offering up the opportunity for BECs to give feedback. Karen and I were both there, and it was such a really important opportunity to hear their voices. So really grateful for that. And then Zinnia also continued to give me guidance on my thinking as we put this together on Friday. So while it's been kind of a board process this way, there's been just some great input along the way. So I want to thank Zinnia and her BEC team for that. Okay, so I took a little bit of liberty. You guys have the Excel sheet. I'm not going to go back to that. So I really did try to lift ideas and thinking from all of us. So, please stop me if I miss something that was like, hey, that was really important and it needs to be a component. And again, Roan and Emily chime in at any point on these areas. What really struck me, and this was partly from the BEC meetings too, I think, is this empowered voice, not just voice, because I felt that we all, yes, voice is important, but it has been elevated in a different way. I think we've been saying voice for a long time, and I think that has shifted in the last couple of years, and I think that needs to continue to stay that way. So that was intentional to kind of ensure that voice from our students and our families, our staff, have a place at the table, and that's recognized and honored. And I do remember Karen saying, in terms of staff who do the right thing, not penalized or punished. And I just appreciated that advocacy being there without risk, I guess. So that was kind of this voice theme. Workforce diversity, of course, I think Jill noted that has been a cornerstone part of our strategic plan forever. For me, and I think for all of you, how do we really, put teeth in that as a board? What can we do to really elevate that? Because that is not new for this district to want to diversify the workforce. And yet, and that's a pipeline issue. That is so many challenges that are often outside our ability. It's a statewide problem. So what is it as a board that we can do to try to really assist that? Professional development, I felt that it came up a lot. I, again, with the I appreciated, again, Karen, and I don't mean to point out Karen's name. I think she and I were just similar on a couple things. And the conversation about, and I am getting a warning that my internet is unstable. So if any of you guys, if I start to lag, flag me, okay, and I'll shut my video off.
You're cutting out quite a bit, Maureen.
Helps.
Can you turn the video off and try that?
Okay. Yeah. So Ben, thanks. I just got that warning to say, I'm unstable, shock. And so we'll see how this goes. But professional development, I think the critical self-reflection that was brought forward from our reading, and then some standards around that. And I think how, again, we are the board, we have a lane. And while the staff and Sue travels up to our lane once in a while, I want to be really careful about that we stay in our lanes. So as we talk about priority standards and evaluations, Zinni and I talked a lot about that. And I remember, and I'm sure Jill does, that Ernie, still in his HR capacity, went through a complete evaluation review. It was 2013. And I don't think that that's been updated. So how do we stay in our appropriate place, but yet again, really push on what is it around culturally responsive practices and inclusion that we want to see in there. That's my thinking. Resources, maybe it's short and sweet. I mean, it really does speak to, and I think that David, works hard to identify that. We certainly have the opportunity to leverage that more now that we have the student investment account than we have before. But I think that's always needs to be front in mind. Are we really, show me where the money is, and that's what you're prioritizing. I had tried to combine resources. I know, Sharon, I think this is a chunk of yours, with culturally responsive practices, and it just was clunky that way. And so John kind of advised me that's a critical part. So why don't we maybe separate that and keep that as a complete part? And then Ben, I know accountability, I think yours was the audit analysis review, that kind of whole enchilada on how do we ensure accountability, which goes back to how do we know it's happening. And Jill, I think I sprinkled, you were short and sweet and to the point and very direct, and I think I picked that up in all areas. So that's kind of my high level. And I know I just saw Tara say that she's having a connectivity issues as well. But so Tara, did you want to do questions from here? Or first, actually, Rowan and Emily, are there things, comments you want to add at this point? Okay. They have nods of no, I think. So Tara, want to go back to board, or I'll put it back to you?
Thanks, Maureen. For me, I'm actually interested to take it back to the board as well, with members seeing in the two sheets that you created, both the themes and actually seeing everyone's individual comments. I'm just interested to hear from board members their thoughts and how this connects to when they think of inequity policy, the actions that they'd like to see and the changes, just what's their feedback on that.
I have a couple initial thoughts that I just wanted to share. One, just kind of clarifying maybe with Maureen that this meeting is not in place of the community process you outlined. This is a precursor to what you outlined. So just because we haven't identified something in our matrix doesn't mean that a community member, teacher, student couldn't bring that forward to that process and say, hey, you left out this issue. So just wanted to I think that's your plan and impression as well.
Thank you, Ben, for that. Absolutely. And okay. I think when we're done, we'll go back and look at that timeline. But what I think the goal here was that we can get to a draft, a true kind of push out round zero that we feel good about to then put forward and absolutely get input. So
perfect. Thank you for clarifying. I just wanted to make sure that was, because I felt all this pressure all of a sudden, did we get everything? No. And I was like, well, I'm not sure. But so to Tara's question, the first thing that comes to mind for me is, and I think this is actually aligned to this question of do we go broad or do we go narrow, which we were talking about the title, but we weren't really talking about the title. We were talking about what is this policy about? And to me, it's about the opportunity gaps, and it's about whether race is a predictor in outcomes. So that to me will be the true test of the efficacy of this policy on the back end. In 10 years, are we more likely to predict a student's academic outcomes based on race, but more than just academics? When we talk about academic gaps, I do want to think more broadly in terms of opportunity and think about extracurricular fees and student leadership involvement and participation in elective classes. And I think what I don't want is us to be so focused on test scores or academic outcomes that all of a sudden we're forcing historically underserved populations into a less enjoyable school experience, which sometimes we have seen as be an outcome in national work around equity or those kinds of policies. So I don't know if that answers Tara's question, but that's where my mind went, is on the back end, race will not be a predictor for student outcomes, both academically and in larger school related terms.
I agree with what you were just saying, Ben, but I would add on to that, one of our measures has to be how comfortable are all of our students at school. And that's where I think the student feedback on our surveys about, do you feel safe? Do you have a grown-up that cares about you in the building? Those need to also not be predictable by race. And so that's why I included those as my metrics. But I agree with you absolutely that the high level outcome should be that race is not a predictor of success, however we define it in our district.
I'm wondering how that part would be measured, because Director Zerschmied, like, is that through the culture survey that we take in 8th grade and 11th grade, or? Okay.
It could well be, yeah. I mean, it could be healthy teens, could be a component of it, right? Because there's a safety piece in there. It could be a new survey that we come up with. It could be the one that we're currently doing. It kind of makes more sense to do one that we've done before, because then we have a longer string of data. But yeah.
Yeah, and I guess it's on the administration, so we don't want to, we said it would be broad. But
actually, I really appreciated what Director Wolf said about, as a board, we need to remember to stay in our lane. And our lane is not to tell the administration what to do, but tell them what we want to get to. And so that's why I really liked Director Bowman's comment about, we want to not be able to predict outcomes by race. That's a very high level, board level goal. And then we tell the administration, you guys, the professional educators, you figure out how to make that happen. And also you figure out how to measure it, because you guys know the measurements better.
And real quickly before, I know I don't want to monopolize here, but that makes me, in terms of board role here versus administration role, and Dr. Sue, I'll look to you on this as well. In terms of, I think a lot of us in looking at Maureen's spreadsheet, I think most of us, if not all of us, actually highlighted this sort of like audit, analysis, review portion of it. Who decides what components are part of that? Because that's maybe the most important part of that process, is what are we reviewing? Obviously academic outcomes is part of this, but the more time you spend thinking about it, the more you can come up with other variables that might be important. So is that something we should be explicit about in policy as a board, or delegate to AR, or some combination thereof?
My gut feeling is that we don't put that in policy. We put that we're going to measure these outcomes, but how we measure them, I would say that's out of our lane.
Yeah, I would like to hear from Dr. Sue as well. I think this is how you start to bridge to the strategic plan too, is how do you define this policy, and so that it really aligns nicely with that work ahead of you.
What I would offer here is, what's our primary mission? Why do we exist? We exist to prepare students academically, but we also exist to prepare them for life. And so statements that anchor to those two, and that race is not a predictor, first and foremost, of your academic ability, nor should it be a predictor of your ability to fully participate and function in society. I think part of our challenge in front of us is the fact, and am knee deep right now in Dr. Eddie Glad's last book, Begin Again. Actually, he was a keynote at NSBA. He's a professor and chair at Princeton University in African American Studies. And in that, he talks about the fact that every time our nation takes a step forward to build capacity and to open doors and to correct the wrongs, there is a backlash. And so I think we just have to be I'm going to offer here for consideration that we have to be prepared for that. And we're already seeing vestiges of it, given the work that we have done this year relative to equity. But how do we set conditions that are clear, that regardless, that this is what we believe is the right way forward? And so I would offer those two, making sure that the opportunity gap for academic achievement is closed, because I don't believe we have an academic gap. We have an opportunity gap. Our kids come with full agency. We have to address that. The second is relative to social emotional well-being and ability to participate in society. And the tough part about this conversation is that we can prepare them for that, but whether or not society lets them in is the next question. And so I think that we have to be really honest about how far we can go, how much we can impact. We can build your capacity and resilience, but it also means that we have to teach advocacy, and we have to be advocates as well for that kind of change outside of our doors. So I would offer that, and both of those are measurable. You can measure those through a formative assessment. In fact, next week when I do the board report as part of your work group, we're going to dig deep into that iReady, and you can see the granularity at which we can take a look at the academic translate opportunity gap. Okay. We can also, to Director Zerschmid's point, we can build additional surveys that are snapshots in time. And I think that's really what we need more of. These, one-time large annuals are helpful. They behave more like a summative, if you will. What we need are formative and interim. So all of that can be measured and developed and measured. I would absolutely caution us that we don't overwhelm and try to gather so much data that it's like ripping the carrot out of the garden and seeing if it's growing every day, right? You need to leave it alone and let it do its thing for a while. But all of those things are measurable. All of those things, district staff currently have the expertise and capacity to bring forward as part of the process. But I would, again, stress, get high level, get, what are the two big markers that you want. When you think about the coherence theory, about the interaction between teacher, student, and content, and what's our theory of action, that's where this policy lies. We believe this, and because of that, the instructional core will do its job relative to these two goals.
I appreciate that framing, Dr. Sue, and I'm just curious for the board members in hearing that and thinking of the things that you specifically suggested and what you saw from your colleagues, and also just feedback from the BEC group, where that leaves you in terms of your thinking. Is anything missing? Are you wondering how, one of the things encapsulates an aspect of this that you really want to see? What's coming up?
I will admit I'm struggling to stay in my lane, especially because of what I heard during the BEC meeting. Because the way that the question was posed to the group was, you guys have been working on this work for a really long time. What's missing? What do you want changed? And so what we heard was, I want this changed for my job or my position, or for me as a person. And I am struggling taking that up to a measurable board goal. So just to admit that I'm struggling.
As you think of some of those specific things, going back to this idea of creating the conditions, what are the conditions that need to be created for those educators, one, to be able to voice their needs, particularly when it's outside of the dominant mainstream of how things are done? How are they empowered to do so and supported to do so? And what are the mechanisms that need to be in place for them to be heard? How do we create the conditions for those things to be brought about and supported?
Well, I think the thing that I'm focused on and realizing that I'm struggling is that definitely heard that exploring cultural responsiveness has been an option up to now, and that how do we shift to it's no longer optional, it's a requirement. And I feel like it's in here in the 2-pager in a couple of ways, but I also, okay, so a board level measurable goal. I mean, I guess, well, no, I did it. That's where my language is, that everybody shall meet or exceed the professional standard that says you're culturally responsive. So, but that's out of my lane to tell you how to evaluate and to prioritize that item as a key evaluation piece. So that's a perfect example of where I'm at.
And Karen, I just appreciate your specificity and your direct honesty, and I am there with you as I sat there and listened. And that's why I wanted to say, I know where I'm supposed to be. I also acknowledge that this is bold to really, how do we as a board set that, recognizing, yeah. So I don't have a great answer, but I just wanted to acknowledge, I appreciate Karen saying, this is why I said it.
So I think the measurable you might be reaching for there, Karen, is at the board says that staff shall receive training in cultural responsiveness. The number of times a year, that's not on us. The number of hours of training, that's not on us. That's all on administration. But just that we expect the administration will provide professional development to staff that will result in this. That's our lane. And I totally empathize with you both for having been in the room, because it's really hard when you're hearing those specific things, but that's not our board work. That's Dr. Smith, Dr. E. Smith's work. So.
Well, that's great, because I have that sentence in there. I just added and coaching, because I felt like it was more than just training, for instance, on a PD day or a staff meeting, but actual support in the classroom with coaching. I
would suggest we keep it broad, whether we call it professional development, and professional development includes all these different kinds of training, rather than trying to spell out it's this and it's this and it's coaching and it's this. We just say, get them there. However you're going to get it there, get them there.
So I'm going to go back to the outcomes to that. And so Dr. Sue helped that. Karen said it's evaluation, and I'm really wrestling here, because you can train until the cows come home. That doesn't mean that you took it, you owned it, and you delivered it in your classroom and made a difference for a kid.
So,
and I've seen TTSD teachers do that in a phenomenal way, and I want to see them all do it. So sorry.
No, not at all. So I apologize, because this isn't my meeting, this is yours. And so forgive me, Tara, and directors. I would offer a path forward. Karen, I hear the struggle, and really policy isn't meant to give that kind of direction. It's meant to set the conditions. And so when as a superintendent, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for affirmation that when I stand up and develop and work and direct my cabinet team to then, in fact, we had this conversation 2 weeks ago where I said, you should be absolutely crystal clear with the staff that reports to you about how we're going to make this happen, meaning closing the opportunity gap and addressing the social emotional needs and resiliency in terms of being a full member of society. Okay. And if we can't do that as a cabinet team, we got work to do. Now, once you've done that, then the next step to that then is the work that Tara and John have been doing so, thoughtfully and consistently with our leadership around what equity means and what equity moves are. This is the next step, which is, and now you need to get off the mountaintop and you need to get into the valley and you need to articulate this to your staff, that this is your expectation, that when we make these moves, Data should change. And so the way you get at that as a principal is to have data conferences with your teachers. And you're basically saying, tell me why this group of students is moving and maybe this one isn't. And what is your plan, teacher, to address that? What do you need from me in terms of capacity building to get there? That's how you close those gaps. And I say that having led that work, as you all know, at McKay High School, at Hauk, at the district level in Salem-Keizer, and again in Springfield. It plays differently depending on the context, but that's it. I am going to inspect what I expect, and I'm going to build your capacity and support you along the way. Part of our challenge relative to TTSD's history has been, thou shalt do, period. And so what happens is you have those at the far end who are, if you heard me talk about the speedboats, who take off with that sucker and make it run, and they're doing amazing work, and you can see it in their data. And then you got the rocks, as I talk about them, or the pole holders on the other end, and they'll just wait you out. What you have to do is really work to that heart and mind component, which is, why wouldn't we want to do this? What's really at the heart of you not wanting to get at that? Is it a belief? Is it a capacity issue? I don't know how to address this child's needs, but whatever it is, those are the hard conversations that have to be had. Excuse me. Been talking all day and no water. Plus the fact it chokes me up when I do this work. But those are the hard conversations. Dr. Lisa and I had them today, which is, I am going to say, once again, now that we are coming back out of COVID and back into building, I'm going to set this frame that basically says, when I walk through buildings in the coming year, I'm going to ask you for two things. I'm going to ask you for your professional development plan. What are you talking about in staff meetings? And I'm going to ask you for your data. And I'm going to be attending all of the leadership meetings, so I know what professional development you've received as an administrator. And now I'm going to ask you how you're operationalizing that. And your data is one piece of evidence. And so it's the same kind of conversation. What I expect, I need to inspect. And when I inspect and see that there's a gap, how can I help you? Okay. So that is on us to bring that type of plan forward as you set the conditions that say, these things should not be a predictor. I can make a real straight line from race should not be a predictor to that conversation I just shared with you. Dr. Lisa and I have had the conversation. I know her wheels are already spinning about how we can get, how we can start to get that. But where our gap in practice has been is relative to, oh, you expected me to do something with that professional development. Okay, that's number one, both in terms of our administration and in terms of our teachers. And again, they do a phenomenal work and they're working very hard. So please don't misunderstand where I'm going with this, but this is hard work. The second piece with that is then adjusting and modifying. Now, you had examples during SIA from Principal Gomez at Deer Creek, where that very conversation was had, that he had with his third and fourth grade teachers. And they were able to close gaps and basically demonstrate that even with less than granular data, they were able to make the instructional shifts they needed to make to address those kids and close those gaps. That's what we want more of. And instead of saying, we hope that you all learn from each other, I'm going to say, my expectation is that you are learning and doing. And because I care about you and because I care about our kids, I wanted to do it well. The last piece I would share with you about that is the fact that we have not seen in this district BECs, TOSAs, lit specialists as members of our principals' leadership teams in schools. And so the principal's working out over here and they're working out over here and no one's having conversation back and forth. And so the frustration on the BEC's part, probably, and the FAPs or FPAs and others, is because there isn't that structure. And so Dr. Lisa and I today had conversation about, let's build capacity in our principals to say, these are members of your think tank. This is your mini cabinet. These are the people you need on your hip. And they need to be standing shoulder to shoulder with you when you do staff professional development. And then they need to be deployed in a way and use funding, and that's a resource issue that comes back to us, that puts them into the classroom, providing just-in-time support to teachers. That's how you're going to shift culture. Not everybody's going to be happy with us, but that's not my, forgive me, while I want people to feel well cared for, we're moving forward. The train has left the station. This is where we're going. So I would offer those pieces. Those are all pieces, Karen, Director Emerson, that we have to operationalize on our end, and you need to hold me and the cabinet, accountable for that work. So if you wanted to speak to it from accountability or from a goals perspective relative to superintendent bringing forth a plan as to how that's going to get operationalized, all in. That's appropriate because I am your agent.
So Dr. Sue, thank you for that explanation. I think it's been consistent with what you've been saying for the last couple of years. What I hear you saying is that it's really kind of the work we've been doing in terms of the improvement cycle, right? Because we're taking these practices and then we're implementing and measuring and see how they're doing and see if they're working. And so that's what I hear you saying, is that it's an extension of kind of the implementation of what we're learning is the data and trying different things as we learn them and to see if the data makes a difference. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, and Director Fox, I would offer to you, we got to shorten that cycle. Number one, we tend to, we've had a history of extending it, perhaps, in hopes that we can get it just right. And I would offer, do not let, what is the saying? Do not let the pursuit of perfect be the enemy of the good that you might do. And so I want to see those cycles shortened. But it's a system of supports. You cannot expect to simply say to your principals, go forth and do. I know what that looks like in my head, but I have no idea how that translates to theirs, except what I see in the data. And so this is a matter of all of us being explicit all the way down the line. It looks like this, it walks like this, it talks like this. And it is in service to this because, and we were able to draw a line from the policy to the plan, to the implementation, to the data. That coherence theory for me has always worked, because if you can't draw a straight line from policy that's on the very outer ring of that model all the way down to the classroom, if you've got breaks, you got to figure out where the break is. That's why I love that model. So it's very telling about where you should start looking to address that. Will we have people who will try to sit it out? Absolutely. That's a given, because we're asking for change. And in this time, we're not really asking as much for instructional change as we are asking for heart and mind change. What do you believe about children whose race is different than yours? What do you fundamentally believe they're capable of or not, as the case may be? And in this district, as I've seen in 2 others, we will love children to death because we don't want to stress them out. And I will tell you that literally is a death sentence. We need to push kids, we need to support kids, we need to scaffold kids, and we need them to really reach in and touch their capacity. And that's what this policy needs to drive us to do. We will not rest until a child has been pushed into their proximal zone of development every single time, regardless of how they look or where they come from or what religion they practice or whatever the issue is. Because every child has that capacity. That's not a pipe dream for me. I've done it. I know that it is possible, and I know that it's sustainable if you have the right systems in place. And quite frankly, I apologize, but it's malpractice when we fail to do it. I firmly believe that. And I, for one, do not want to be guilty of malpractice. And I know that the majority of our teachers do not either. And those that are struggling, it is simply because we're asking them to make some massive shifts in terms of their heart and mind and the doing. And it's hard. It's very, very difficult work. But it's not impossible. We need to do hard things. There's nothing wrong with doing hard things.
So I don't think this board shied away so far of hard things. I think that's why, we want to kind of end our tenure, with trying to set something up for success for the next next board members. But I wanted to add on to your comments that I really, when I talked with Zinnia a week or two ago, we talked about the humanity of every student. And usually when we discriminate, oppress, it's because we dehumanize. And I don't think Maureen knew where to put it, and I think you put it under staff development evaluation. I just put a statement in there about that. And I also emphasized resiliency and worth, because one thing that me personally is, and I've been saying this with our trauma-informed stuff, is that assets-based, really resiliency. We want to focus on our students' strengths and not their deficits. And so that's just my reasoning for putting that in there, those two things. So I just wanted to kind of say those things.
So I'm appreciating where the conversation is going. And Dr. Sue, you initially apologized, but I greatly appreciate what you shared, because especially in this context, in terms of the board creating policy that creates the condition, there needs to be some dialogue from you and understanding what that looks like to support you and the cabinet and putting these things to action. So I greatly appreciate that. So we've talked a lot about, and rightly so, but about not being able to predict a student's outcomes and achievement, based on race. Are there any other aspects of this policy that you think we need to call out and really think about what it means to create the condition and have that included in the policy in a way that supports Dr. Sue and the cabinet and keeps us in our lane?
One other thing that's coming to my mind for that question is like the TTSD community, including teachers, administrators, school board members, students, parents, have a clear understanding of what equity means in this district and how we operationalize it. A common definition, a common understanding, because I think that's something missing right now. Equity means a million different things to a million different people. And so if this policy can help us build a common understanding and a common vision that we're all walking in the same direction toward, I think that would be a huge win.
That matches the structure of the equity policy that North Clackamas put forward, where in their opening paragraphs, they define what do they mean by equity. It's this. And then they go on to, and we direct the superintendent to make sure that these, whatever it is, I can't remember now, half dozen elements are included in, day-to-day work.
I wholeheartedly agree that we have definitions, and I took a stab at some. But when for Tara's question, I feel like the things that we identified are all the things that we know will make an impact on outcomes. So I don't know that I have any other outcome other than that the gap has been closed. Because that's why we want to include voice, because that will help, and a diverse workforce will help, and more training will help, and a culturally responsive whole everything about the community will help. Isn't that I guess that's why I wanted it to be educational equity, because that is the thing that we want to do. I don't know that there's a second thing.
I think there's a it's not social equity, that's the wrong word, but it's more than just educational, because it's not just test scores. There's other stuff that's the more personal, human. This is me as an individual, and I keep coming back to feeling safe in our schools. I think that's a big component. And that's why it's not just educational in my mind.
And if I could add some context to that as well, thank you, Director. I totally agree with all of that. Is just remembering just how broad our community is and the diversity of our stakeholders. Not everyone has been immersed in these equity conversations as you all have. And so, for some folks, when they hear, educational, they go directly to academics, scores, the common data that we use, and they don't understand it as broadly and under the equity umbrella as we may have grown to understand it. And so as we think about language, and it's not time yet to really hone in exactly on the language we're going to use yet, but as we think about it and move towards that, that's definitely something that we want to keep in mind. There are some spaces where specificity is going to be important. As Dr. Bowman said, defining what this means for the TTSD school district and community. But then there are other ways where we don't want to assume that everyone is where we are. So we want to be clear in that.
Can I say something as well related to that? I feel like there's also been a lot of feedback, at least from the families that I've been able to connect with, where they said, my child is doing well academically, but their social emotional well-being is deteriorating because of, we heard it in the hate speech process, we heard it in all these other pieces. It's one thing to have academic success and then leave a system not whole. So there's that part of it that I wanted to offer as a perspective as well, because especially when we checked in with a lot of our communities that maybe even recently immigrated here, the focus on education is the wellness of their child. Holistically. So I just wanted to offer that too, because I think if we center educate only on the academics and those markers for success, that is by definition biased, right? So I just wanted to offer that perspective.
Okay, so a second one would be about culture and co-alignment. I think I'm hearing, and I don't know that we kind of have that in culturally responsive and inclusive practices, but not quite what I'm hearing with the social emotional wellness of our kids.
Can I just clarify something? Because I was kind of thinking, I was thinking pretty deeply about this on Friday, and I struggle with sometimes with the word equity because it's a means of achieving an outcome. So it's the fairness or impartiality in which we distribute our resources. That's I looked it up in the dictionary. We talk about equity. I know it means a lot of things because we talk about the equity umbrella, and I know we refer a lot of things, but is there something else that describes what we're trying to achieve other than that word? Because to me, it's a means, it's our intent. We want to distribute, well, I put it in my little thing, my points or whatever, that it's to distribute resources to provide opportunities based upon the needs of each individual student. Equitable resources include funding, programs, policies, initiatives, and supports that recognize each student's unique background and identity to ensure that all students have access to high quality education. Not that that's our definition of equity, but it's our intent of how we're going to use equity or fairness of distribution of resources based on students' needs to achieve our purpose of academic achievement and making kids feel welcome and safe. So I just wanted to see if others differ in that, or is that are we kind of all on the same page, or am I way off?
So, Sharon, since the room's quiet, I'm not as good of just a listener as opposed to a visual person. So I will be honest that as that definition kind of went on, I kind of got lost in the kind of soul of that, if that makes sense. I did kind of also wonder, I just think of things differently now. I'm like, I wonder who wrote the dictionary. Sorry, but I don't want to lose sight of, I feel, to Ben's point, the second point, focusing on whose community, whose staff, who's our families. Do they know what equity means in TTSD? I just want clarity. I don't want to get lost in now new words or different words, or even the umbrella of culture. I mean, let's get as crisp as we can. And I know that gets harder, right? The fewer words you use, the harder you fight for the words. But the more you use, you get lost and go, okay, yeah, whatever. And then we're back talking about this. Well, I mean, the board will continue talking about it. So my drive is succinct, clarity on what we really care about. So then that drives Dr. Sue and her team to accomplish what they want. And I'm struggling with the words right now, but that was what I was thinking in my honesty. But I appreciate your analysis and your deep thinking around that. So,
and I think you and I are in agreement, because I was just saying that you don't have to like what I said, but the way I said it. But what my point is that it's a means. It's not necessarily what we're trying to achieve. And so I guess all I'm asking is, yes, we need to define what we mean by equity, so that everybody's clear. No matter how big, I agree, it needs to be larger than education. But how do we make that clear to the community? So I'm in agreement with you. I just don't know what that is.
Go ahead, Jill. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to piggyback on what Director Wolf said a little bit, because when I made my answers to the questions, I made them really brief and succinct on purpose, for exactly that reason. I really think this policy needs to be a page, maybe a page and a half. That definition of equity needs to be up front and center, because it's going to be called the equity policy, right? And so what does equity mean? That needs to be defined. I don't want to get into a policy that then lists definitions of 10 other terms or 5 other terms. I want it to be a high level, setting the tone for the district. And that's really what I'm getting is, these are what we as a district believe. This is the tone for the district that we're going to set. And that's what the administration is going to operate on underneath the board setting that tone. So succinct is really important.
Something that I would add to this conversation too is, with all of these points that have been put on the table, I just want to remind everyone that we still need to hear from the community and hear what our stakeholders, what that term equity and what this policy means to them and what they want to see. And I say this not to advocate either or, but another frame of reference for this is, this equity policy gives the board and your superintendent and building leaders an opportunity to make things that have been invisible up until now visible. So regardless of how we have understood the word equity or any other word that may come into this policy up until now, that is our lens and our understanding. So as a community, how do we need to think about these things differently? How do we capture what's most meaningful for our stakeholders without getting caught up on nitpicking definitions and, what this means? And I say that not to diminish Director Fox's feedback, because I hear you, that's important, but let's be careful as we move forward in this, and let's not get too entrenched in verbiage without hearing from the other stakeholders. And let's not lose focus on what is most meaningful about what we're trying to do. Because at the end of the day, you will define the terms, you will frame how those terms are being used in the context of the work at TTSD. And that is what is most important.
If I can, there's one. I appreciate. I don't really have anything to add to that conversation. To be honest, I was a little bit lost about some of the whether there was disagreement, whether there wasn't disagreement. I think we're all kind of broadly moving in the same direction, and there are minor differences of understanding. One thing responsive, I think, to one of Chair Wolf's first questions about like is there anything missing, that I just wanted to sort of like put out there, not trying to open another can of worms, but just identifying something that I think is really important, is the curriculum, instructional materials, assessment piece, which we have a policy that governs those things currently. And so I'm not suggesting that necessarily we have a piece about curriculum here, but when I think back to some of the engagement we've heard from students in particular, but also parents over the last year, curriculum and having representation in curriculum was identified consistently as a deficiency in our district and broadly, I think, across America's public education system. And we've also heard from our team in this district about how challenging it's been to identify curriculum that would meet the standards that we all have set out. So what I wrote in my feedback is acknowledging all of those things to be true. We, I think, have an opportunity to kind of be a model here and be a leader, and whether it be constructing our own or working directly with curriculum companies or some combination, employing our teachers, whatever it is. And, Dr. Sue and I have spoken about this in the past. I sort of feel similarly about curriculum that I feel about workforce diversification, which is we've had this priority, but it hasn't had enough sort of force of policy behind it that I want to kind of elevate it to that next level. So not trying to insert curriculum into this policy unless there is consensus that we should, but wanting to make sure that while we have this momentum and this spotlight on equity in TTSD, curriculum has been identified by our constituents as a priority that we're not meeting. So just want to kind of enter that into the conversation, just so it's not getting lost or forgotten.
Director Bowman, in taking a look and also at Director Wolf's urging relative to policy IF, as I read through that and thinking about when that policy was written and where the state is now, and what's coming down the pike in terms of, I'm now in the back of my head thinking through House Bill 2001, which it very explicitly calls out cultural and linguistic competency, including native languages that are not necessarily instructed, as a condition to forestall RIF within your workforce in support of that. So I think that there will be possibly some language or some concepts that could be taken or lifted out of that into this policy. Thinking about Senate Bill 334, which directs boards and superintendents to have professional development that is geared relative to these equity issues. There may be some language there, but relative to curriculum and relative to workforce, two things that top of mind, 9 times out of 10, it's about resource. So one of the things that does fall to the board, policy, budget, superintendent, that in this policy, you call out all three. All right, we're developing a policy that we have an expectation that resource will be allocated in this way. Okay, rather than this is the resource we want, we expect it to be allocated in this way. Okay, to culturally responsive curriculum, to workforce development, because what that does then as a placeholder, and I'm looking at David, who's probably going, please don't promise them anything, but that you anchor that it's an expectation that district resources will, as a function of this policy, be directed to address those two issues. To continue to consistently, because again, I'm thinking about sustainability. We've done a tremendous amount of work. We've got 3 board members going off. We've got 2 who hold the institutional knowledge, and it's much, Director Bowman, as it is with the legislature. Enough of those that hold the institutional wisdom leave. No one knows why you're doing what you're doing. And so again, it's that through thread, and budget is one of those things. So when I think about us, standing up, grow your own, which we have, it's a budget issue. When I think about aspiring leaders, and that's something that Dr. Lisa and Associate HR Director Len Reed are working on, developing a relationship with Lewis and Clark to diversify our administrative forces and look to aspiring administrators. that takes resource. So that is certainly one way in which the board, that it falls to the board. It is in your lane that you can call out that will support that. And then we can also then work on policy IF, which is more the nuts and bolts of how to get there.
I appreciate that. And that makes a lot of sense. And I think the question will be, how do we say that in a policy? Like, you have the board's permission and expectation to use resources, something like that.
Resources will, we direct resources or allocate resources to, or are committed to allocating resources. Something that's a little stronger than we wish we could do that. Something that basically says this is, to Director Un's point, where your heart is, that's where your money will go to. So if this is something that is foundational for you, and it should be, I would agree with your position, then we would want to say explicitly that we will put resource to it.
I appreciate that. And I think the other thing that I kind of like, if I had to simplify just to very simple terms, where I think we should go in terms of policy IF is a line that says, if curriculum does not meet the equity standards of this district in terms of racial bias, it will not be adopted, regardless of alternatives considered. It's like, we won't adopt it. We'll make our own. We'll contract with someone to create some. That's kind of where I'm at. But anyway, I want to hear from other board members.
I agree with almost everything you just said, Director Bowman, except if a curriculum doesn't have everything we want, we might still adopt it, but with the caveat from the board, or with the added addendum from the board, we want these holes filled, and we want staff to come up with a curriculum, and we authorize money for a little bit extra over the purchase price of the curriculum. Because and over time, this problem, I'm hoping, will solve itself as more and more curriculum companies hear school districts talking this way. They need to shift gears fast and get curriculum that really does represent students and teach students' experiences, students' cultures experiences, I should say, excuse me. And so they will get there, but we need something that kind of bridges us to that point, so that we can adopt a curriculum, because there are not, there's only 3 out there that are decent curriculums on math, for example, but they don't teach all of what we want. So that's my sort of addition to what you just said.
Director Searchmead, I would also offer to you that there are many entrepreneurs that are now coming into this space. One of which is Black History 360. And it's an extremely well-written curriculum. We just have not had the bandwidth this year to really do a deep dive, but Eugene Forget is probably going to adopt it. It's actually one of my former grad students who's part of that work. They are also, and this is a national effort, so this is a national group, but they are also building a similar curriculum relative to the Latinx population as well. And the thrust of it is to put into the space in terms of American history from the position of this culture's and race's agency and strengths, and telling the story from that perspective in terms of history. And I would offer that it is both well done, and it will convict your soul when you're done. And it is likely to raise a few eyebrows along the way, which is exactly what it's meant to do. But there are entrepreneurs, as I say, that are coming into this space, and the board that stood themselves up of individuals are all academics from a variety of political perspectives, but all that represent our historically underserved populations. And this is a seminal event for them. This is their work. This is the space they want to occupy. So I would say it's going to get better over time. We're not going to be looking to the Pearsons and to the Houghton Mifflins and to the whatnot. I mean, they'll be late adopters. It's going to have to be to some of these others that we're going to have to point towards.
One of the things as this rich conversation is going on is I'm watching the clock and thinking about the next steps to this. there seems to be quite a bit of consensus around some of the core components of a policy draft, and kind of what it would look like in the sense of brevity, direct and to the point. And I know that there are still some pieces that still need to be considered, such as the name, and even in terms of equity, how we define that as a district and the framing that we set forth in this policy. But it sounds like there's enough consensus and enough has been shared in this call, as well as in the written materials that you submitted, that we should be able to draw up at least a draft to share with community members for their feedback and their input. So with that being the next step that we embark upon, are there any thoughts? I was going to say final thoughts, but that sounds too final. Are there any thoughts or recommendations that you would like to see, at least in the draft? And it's just a draft, nothing final, but anything standing out to you that you think needs to be included in that?
So I'm going to keep coming back to the North Clack equity policy, because I think its structure will suit us very well in this regard. It's got a paragraph or two explaining, defining equity, why it's important, why the school district believes it. I think there's a section that's the district has the following beliefs, and then there's numbered items, bump, bump, bump. And then there's to get to where we want to be, the board commands the superintendent to do to get these things done, right? These outcomes done. And so if we can do a similar structure, we can kind of cut and paste in the ideas that the board's come up with so far. And then I would say, take that to our community, to our students, and say, here's our draft. And then they can fill in whatever we've missed. They can do some fine tuning of it. They can take stuff out that sounds stupid to them, and then we've got that input, and then bring it back to the board and we can do our fine tuning on it. That's kind of my overall assessment.
I agree with you, Jill. I think that was my favorite of all the examples, the North Clackamas. It was succinct. I liked the way it was organized. I'd make a few changes, but I like the idea of taking it as a framework and adding the stuff that we've put together as a starting point for the community.
I'm there, and I think they're missing the social emotional thing that we need to add as well. So I don't know if that's that every student feels seen, heard, and valued, or if they feel safe and welcome, but something like that alongside with the "we will not rest until every student reaches their potential." I wrote that from Sue.
Any other thoughts? That's great. Director Wolf, I know that we've covered a lot and there's a lot to kind of synthesize and pull together, but just roughly, do you have an idea yet for the next steps and what everyone can expect in terms of the creation of this draft outline that we're going to share with the community?
Yeah, I would like Vice Chair Bowman to work with me this week to try to get us where we need to on a draft. And I think what's tugging in the back of my mind is, so I'm going to go back to when I started and had, I think that Ben and I and Tara and John had an initial meeting about, what role does calling out race have in this policy. I know I had that with Dr. Sue and Zinnia and Dr. McCall. And so I feel like we're having these great conversations and I keep coming back to the beginning of a core. And I'm just wondering if we've embraced that enough. But I'm going to take what I've heard and feel like Ben and I'm sure we'll touch base with Zinnia, Sue, Tara, John, and before we, put it out to the world. But I have been trying to take best notes I can to create the policy that would be expected, if that makes sense.
I'm thinking about what you just said, and I think I understand in terms of your question about, because we have talked about this quite a bit, like just how much we call out issues surrounding race. But does it, I mean, to me, what I heard from the group tonight is that there's kind of consensus around that broad statement of the fact that race will not be a predictor of academic outcomes, and also, I don't know the exact language, but also their experience in terms of the SEL piece. I know that's messy, but
Okay.
I mean, do we have agreements there? Or is there a desire to go deeper or telescope further out, or, well?
It's an important comment or statement.
Yeah.
And I also think this is really important that it acknowledges the supports or the expectations we have for all our students. And so I don't want, I just think that's more and more important that that is acknowledged as well. So I just felt like I needed to put that back out because I felt like that's where I was charged to start. And so I just wanted to make sure that people felt comfortable with that.
Great.
So Rowan, Emily, anything that you guys want to add? You've been listening wonderfully, but just wanted to see if you had anything to share. Okay.
Well, one thing that I'll share just really quickly, Director Wolf, and this really goes to all of you, is just great appreciation for this work, because in working with you and just doing this work broadly, it's hard work, and it's hard work leading the charge in the areas of equity. And I just really appreciate the thoughtfulness, the consideration of stakeholders and community members, and just all that you're hearing from and holding as you try to lead this work with integrity and really create something strong and lasting for the district. So thank you very much. Appreciate your work.
Yeah, and as I look at this, I'm looking at the timeline, sorry, you guys, I'm not being clear. What we had, it's not exactly, we're not following it exactly, but we're meeting again. We had a first read as April 26th. What I'd like to do is maybe consider that it's in the board packet, right? That and what I don't want to do is spend a lot of time again, but there's this piece of me that feels like just from a board, FYI, this is it. And then the timeline was to have it out in the community April 26th to May 10th. So what I'd really like to prefer is, what does that look like? In terms of how do we actually ensure that we've received feedback from the community, if that makes sense. I don't want to spend an hour talking about the policy again on Monday, but talk more about how do we get feedback. So, okay. Sue, do you have any thoughts? Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, Maureen, so can we talk about it now since we have 15 minutes left about what that looks like, the community feedback? Just a thought, unless you want that to be more people present or something. Yeah, that. We can't hear you, Maureen.
I'm sorry, Sharon, I'm confused as to what you're asking. Are you saying you want to talk about what the community feedback process is, or? Yeah,
I thought that's what we were going to talk about on Monday. I just thought, is there any reason, since we have a few minutes left, that we couldn't start that conversation now, or for time's sake?
No, there's no reason. I guess I was thinking that I would, have that conversation if it's Zinnia or Dr.
Okay.
McCall or pursue. But you know, and if you guys are ready to share something, we can do that. But I hadn't said, hey, what's a good way to do this? I haven't asked them to have that ready.
Okay, gotcha. I understand. I was just thinking, like, were you thinking a survey? But obviously you haven't had that conversation yet, so that's okay.
Well, I think the trick is, Sharon, right? What we've learned is we can certainly have it as a survey and get some feedback. That will not give us the complete feedback that we need. And that's what we're most focused on, which Sue, Dr. McCollins, and you will need to help us with.
Okay. Thank you. I can wait.
Okay. All right. Well, that's, I want to thank you all. Tara, thank you so much for walking us through this as well. And Sue, is any other final thoughts before we call it a night? Okay.
Just gratitude to you all for doing this work. It really is a foundational piece to really making, finishing the next piece of work that we've been working at for so long. So thank you for that.
Okay, Tara, anything else?
Just the same, just gratitude and thank you for this hard work and wrangling us all together, and the examples and compiling everyone's feedback. I think this is off to an amazing start. I'm excited to see what you're able to create.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for your time this evening. And with 13 minutes to spare, I'll give you back this evening. Wish you all a nice evening. So thank you. We are adjourned.
Good night,
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.